There used to be a diagnosis for enslaved Africans who wanted to escape called drapetomania, for example. Literally, they would say, if you want to get off this plantation and stop working for free, you're crazy.
Yes.
Or my apologies for using the word crazy, but they created a diagnosis.
Well, they would say that.
Yeah, crazy. They would say crazy, but something's wrong with your mind if you want to escape this whip in 12-hour days. So,
and I think that sentiment continues to exist. If you want to be Black and you're unsatisfied with the way that things are today, specifically as it relates to your community, there's something wrong with you.
Draped though.
Yeah. So yes, there's a history for both the DSM and for assessment. Assessment specifically cognitive assessments were created to exclude people. Like that was the intention of it.
Welcome back to the Know Your Rights Camp podcast, where knowledge is power and power is people. Today, we're joined by Dr. Krystel Edmonds Biglow. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Can you introduce yourself to the people?
Yes. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in the greater Los Angeles area, and I have a psychological corporation consulting collective. And we provide a variety of services. And one of the services that we specialize in is assessment of a variety of learning disabilities for children, adults, and adolescents. We also work with regional centers. We're a training program. I've also taught graduate school and have other expertise, which includes trauma and other behavioral health disorders. And then I'm specifically interested in and have been trained in multicultural and community clinical psychology. So that's the lens by which I understand all my direct service practice and the way that I train other clinicians.
Wow. It sounds like you have a lot of experience at an educational and clinical level with Black and Brown youth, and probably more experience than other folks out there. So what are some barriers that you see in those settings?
Yes, I think there are quite a few barriers, but there are two main streams. So one, there is implicit bias in just service providers in general in working with Black and Brown communities. The stereotypes about our communities are that, we're inadequate, our children are poorly behaved, impulsive, aggressive, behaviors hard to manage, also lower cognitive functioning. And those beliefs about our communities impact the assumptions and expectations that service providers like pediatricians and teachers have for our children and adolescents and adults in the community. So, for example, if a 3-year-old is having difficulty regulating themselves in a classroom and is also having some deficits or delays in speech acquisition, the default assumption is that the environment is not enriched and that the caregivers are poor disciplinarians, rather than could there be an organic explanation for the difficulties that the child is having. And if a caregiver asks for support, they can often be perceived as complaining or like they're looking for money from the system to get financial support for their kid, or like they're trying to game the system rather than being a parent that is astutely aware of what is going on with their child and they're trying to get them some services.
Wow. So it sounds like both the child is being stereotyped and racialized.
Absolutely.
And the caregiver.
Absolutely.
The whole family.
The whole family. And I've heard about studies where children as young as 3 years old, Black children specifically, could be doing the same behavior as other students, but the preschool teacher would view them as more hyperactive or just view different things and, literally the same behavior, but it's being
And the
viewed.
same also goes for giftedness. So if there's a child, which is also a type of neurodivergence, so if a child is precocious and they have a hard time sitting still because they understand everything you said in 5 minutes, even though it's going to take you 15 minutes to teach the class, they're still going to be thought of as disruptive, versus their Caucasian counterpart will be considered or called precocious. And that happens a lot chronically in the community and in community settings as well, like daycare centers, education centers, et cetera. And then the other side is because Black and brown people have suffered oppression multi-generationally, there's a self-consciousness about being any other type of different. So there is a global negative perception of individuals who have behavioral struggles in Western culture. We pretend like we value exceptionalism, but really there's pressure for conformity. And when anyone acts outside of the norm, except for a small, swath of the population, they are negatively perceived and negatively treated. And so there's like an epigenetic understanding, meaning that our genes carry our oppression. So there's an intuitive understanding that being different can be unsafe. And so if a teacher or a physician or a psychologist suggests to a Black or brown parent that their child could be neurodivergent or could have a behavioral health problem, for many people, the immediate response is fear, and then there would be a resistance about that. We also have a strong value for deference towards authority, and so the immediate reaction for a child struggling to be compliant will be to penalize the behavior. And then even if a parent suspects, because we're also collective cultures and we defer to aunts, uncles, grandparents, play aunties, and everybody else in the village. So if you think there's something wrong, but then your village is like, oh, there's nothing wrong, you're just too soft on him or her, or you need to be more strict, like that also then undermines help-seeking behavior with the primary caregiver. So those are the two big themes that impact whether or not or how quickly a child will be identified as needing assessment or support.
Got it. And neurodivergence is already something that's hard for a lot of folks to understand. Are there ways that could be misdiagnosed? Because, again, what you're saying is that the symptoms come across as defiant or anything like that. So what are ways to remedy that?
Yeah, so you're making a good point. So in the education system, neurodivergent children, African-American children in particular, are often put in, like if they end up getting special education support, their category is often emotional disturbance rather than something like other health impairment, which would account for like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or autism if they're showing symptoms of autism. In clinical settings, if a caregiver tries to take their child to a community mental health clinic, they're likely to be seen as having like conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder rather than them considering neurodevelopmental disorders. So the workaround for that, one is what you guys are doing. There needs to be a lot more education in just the media space about what is neurodevelopmental disorder and what is neurodivergence, and specifically like what is emotional dysregulation, the many ways that anxiety can manifest, so that even caregivers will know, well, I heard or I read that this might be something else, and they'll have the tools to advocate for their child in an educational setting or in a clinical setting to push, like, can you consider something else? Like, we don't have a reason that the child has a conduct disorder. They haven't experienced any adverse experiences. Is it possible there could be something else? So just normalizing understanding of neurodivergence and what you guys are doing contributes to that. Is a way to just empower all communities overall to understand the diverse way of being a human.
And speaking about that, can you give us just a general definition of neurodivergent and how?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it depends on who you ask.
Right.
So in the context of this discussion, I'm defining neurodivergence as the way that you're born with your brain wired a particular way that will manifest in behaviors that create difficulties for you in the current culture. Emphasis on difficulties in the current culture, because symptoms of autism, symptoms of ADHD were gifts and can still be gifts now, but were definitely gifts that sort of helped humanity in antiquity. When I do training, I try to help a lot of individuals, especially with ADHD, struggle to sleep through the night. And I always say, and I tell parents as well, like, these are descendants of the night watchers. While we were all asleep, they also have extrasensory perception. So like while the rest of the clan was sleeping, like they heard the predator far away, like far enough to wake everybody up to get them moving. And they don't sleep well at night, but they could sleep during the day while everybody else was gathering, hunting, doing clay, whatever. Being able to be hyper-focused. Again, if we're like nomadic and we're walking around, like they're going to notice the nuance of this red berry versus that one. And that one killed the clan member last time, but that one didn't. So this is safe to eat. And in today's time, like hyper focus is what created the space industry. Hyper focus is what creates the art that we love, including visual art or books. Like hyper focus, a lot of gifted people who have the capacity for hyper focus often have a significant contribution to society. And so there's a place for that. And if the person with that gift or skill is supported, we don't know like what amazing contribution they could have versus forcing individuals to have the same capacity for attention that most other people do. Like that should not be the response.
It seems like there's this sort of push and pull about being rigid with diagnoses.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned before when we were just prepping for this discussion that there have been changes even about what certain diagnoses look like.
Absolutely. So in 2013, and then even more recently, but there wasn't a substantive change in the recent update. But the diagnostic manual that is used by behavioral health providers was updated in 2013. And the criteria for autism specifically and autism and ADHD, in addition to some other things like trauma disorders, were all changed. And another potential barrier to accurate diagnoses, clinicians who were trained and worked a lot before 2013 sometimes still have a paradigm shift struggle, and they continue to conceptualize individuals according to the old paradigm. And our understanding of autism specifically and ADHD and additionally changes rapidly, almost like our understanding of tech. Like, because so many individuals who are on the spectrums of one or the other or both are disclosing their experiences more, and it's informing. I even inform myself and update my own assessment procedures by immersing myself in social media posts for neurodivergent individuals. Like I've gotten ideas about what to look for stemming, the notion of self-stemming. I use the word neurospicy instead of saying neurodivergent because I'm not convinced it's very divergent anymore.
Neurospicy, I like that.
Yeah, so I can't claim the term, but I love using the term. So if you're not a person who consumes literature by individuals who have had certain experiences, or make an effort to immerse yourself in the culture, be it online or in real life, of individuals who have been diagnosed or experienced the symptoms, then your understanding about the nuance is going to be limited to the book. And the book does not define objectively what a diagnosis is. It tells you what symptoms are statistically significant within a category. Like, so if you're looking for depression, it's statistically likely that people with depression will have these symptoms, but it doesn't mean that you can't be depressed and have other symptoms.
Exactly.
So that's also misunderstood. And so we have to understand what are the symptoms and experiences that aren't represented in the DSM to be good, effective diagnosticians.
And that was a question I had when you talk about this book, if you were talking about the DSM that happened in 2013, you said, right? But also, let's talk about the history of these books and just the assessment of and diagnoses of illnesses and mental health issues. Because my understanding, the DSM in the 1980s considered homosexuality a mental illness.
Absolutely.
Right? And then throughout the history of, if you want to call it the mental health field, more like the science field in America, there used to be a diagnosis for enslaved Africans who wanted to escape called drapetomania, for example. Literally, they would say, if you want to get off this plantation and stop working for free, you're crazy.
Yes.
Or my apologies for using the word crazy, but they created a diagnosis.
Well, they would say that.
Crazy. They would say crazy, but something's wrong with your mind if you want to escape this whip in 12-hour days. So,
and I think that sentiment continues to exist. If you want to be Black and you're unsatisfied with the way that things are today, specifically as it relates to your community, there's something wrong with you.
Draped over.
Yeah. So yes, there's a history for both the DSM and for assessment. Assessment specifically cognitive assessments were created to exclude people. Like, that was the intention of it. Now they're updated, and there are ways that you can use them to be more culturally responsive, but your implicit bias needs to be checked,
right?
So that you can be mindful and intentional about how you're interpreting information. The same with the DSM. Like, if your implicit bias is checked, you can look at the categories and think about, what does a broad category mean about someone's experience? And is their behavior maladaptive is the point. And maladaptive is relative to someone's environment and the goals of their culture, their family, and their life. There's not an objective truth about what is a good or bad way to be human. And that is something that I will say that all clinicians don't necessarily keep at top of mind. Like, there is a sort of normal that exists in their head, and they evaluate everyone against this established norm. But the norm is the dominant social paradigm. It is what we are told a person should be doing and how they should be behaving. And so maladaptive isn't considered from the perspective of the person's values and culture and goals, but a normative standard. And the same as they normalize, or they create a normative sample of what struggle looks like. And it is often limited to a very small percentage of the population. It should not be generalized to the human condition.
Right.
Just wanted to say, I really appreciate how you're talking about what it means to be human. I think there's this sort of misconception that when you talk about mental health, it's how to be normal, which is what you're talking about. There is no standard for normal. There shouldn't be a standard for normal. So I really appreciate that you're reminding us that mental health is how to be human.
Yes. Yeah. How to achieve joy and satisfaction in a way that you define that, depending on where you are on Earth and at what time you're on Earth. And what we consider normative now would be very different, like even in 1532. So like, we have to remember that all the time. Like, when we start talking about humans being dysfunctional or disabled.
Right. No, and I liked how you mentioned and your experience has culture in it, in your background and training, because certain societies, their concept of mental illness or schizophrenia, even severe mental illness,
Yeah.
you see people integrated in society more. Whereas I feel like in the United States, we otherize people and we put them to the side. We put them on a special bus, put them in a special part of the schools. And then also schools specifically do a lot with not assessing, what's actually happened.
Yes.
There's so many undiagnosed learning disabilities and dyslexias. And so how does that impact students and families when, maybe they are displaying these symptoms, but the school isn't recognizing them?
Yeah. So I think what happens when we aren't diagnosed and given the resources, then the quality of life that we have for ourselves as individuals and then for our families and communities after that are negatively impacted. So if we're specifically looking at like Black males, then we're looking at a shorter line to prison because there's impulsivity. There is the attention span is impacting their capacity to learn how to read. And so then when they get to certain levels, like their opportunity to develop careers that require reading comprehension, whether it's college or not, is impacted because someone didn't recognize that their attention span was impacting their ability to learn how to read. Same with math. So not diagnosing or not catching learning disabilities, whether they're specific learning disabilities like dyslexia, math, learning disability, ADHD, autism, if they are accompanied by learning disabilities, because they all aren't.
Right.
Then you make it more difficult for a person to function in this culture because our culture loads on cognitive training, whether we're in school or not. And that creates a barrier for them. And then the alternate way to support yourself is through crime.
Right.
So you just marginalize them outside of the culture and prevent them from becoming productive humans, and also humans who feel good about their capacity to contribute.
Right.
And belong.
The efficacy part, right? Just
Yeah.
the part to experience success and know that they can be successful in other sectors. And I know with Black boys specifically too, there's also something on the other end of the spectrum with overdiagnosis, right?
Yes.
Where, I myself was actually diagnosed as having a behavioral disorder or disability in elementary school, and I would be taken out of classes and given special attention. But like you mentioned, some of those things could have been viewed as gifted had I looked a little bit different, So what? How does that balance? Where you have both underdiagnosing being an issue, but also overdiagnosing or fear of overdiagnosing.
Yeah, and then also when I think about some of the notes, also the family's fear of the child being labeled and like what that will do for their ability to receive the best instruction possible. And it goes back again to implicit bias, and there has to be exerted efforts in all disciplines related to service that help people explore what their assumptions are about different groups of people and how that is going to interfere with them providing the best service and seeing people objectively. Having consultants like who are culturally trained. So if you're a school district and you're wondering, like, are you capturing all the gifted kids? It's okay. So LA Unified can't afford to do that. But you can't afford a consultant to come in and just check all the schools, the kids, and like, is there another way we can think about this kid?
Right.
Like, are we missing something? So if there's a will, there's a lot of strategies to overcome that. But over pathologizing Black males is related to just a negative perception about the Black community overall, that boys will misbehave, boys are violent, et cetera. And that really came to a head around the 80s and early 90s during the crack epidemic. Gross misdiagnosis of ADHD, and then a counter reaction in the Black community saying that ADHD doesn't exist.
Right.
So there's these extremes that, the extreme reaction that try to humanize our own children, which also led to a disservice. And there's just so many systemic barriers, but there can be solutions with people who are informed, who are culturally informed service providers, helping and consulting all these different systems and disciplines to help them be better at what they do.
Nice.
Yeah.
To that end, what is the name of, I don't think you mentioned it, the name of your services or your
Our company is called Consulting Collective. Yeah, and we're a group, a collective of clinicians who have various clinical expertise. Everyone has a focus on culturally informed care. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to expand services at this point to provide like more psychoeducation and family and community coaching around these specific things so that families will like have tools or a partner to help them advocate during IEPs, or if their child has a behaviorist, is the behaviorist doing what they're supposed to do? If they were rejected by the regional center, should they appeal in a particular way?
Nice.
So we're trying to include those services and not just do we give you a diagnosis, but we also diagnose adults who many other clinicians won't see them.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a powerful service. The whole family can get served there. And it sounds like you all are helping to decolonize our mental health system.
We're trying real hard.
Yeah, to introduce culture.
Trying really, really hard. And we also, like for families and individuals that we diagnose, like I try to do, which makes me extremely busy, so I have to learn to delegate. But I try to do the feedback with all of our clients, because one of the things that I want them to know is that this term doesn't mean that you're defective.
Right.
And that you have all kinds of gifts, spiritual ones included. Mm-hmm. Often people with autism and ADHD have a stronger intuition and other spiritual gifts that the discipline, the culture, no one wants to talk about that in general, because they're like, even, is that a real thing? Like, is it objective? Can you measure that? But like, without spirituality, there is no humanity.
Right.
So helping them get the tools to develop a positive relationship with themselves and mourn the affirmation that they didn't receive, because often when they're adults and they get diagnosed, they've had a lot of messages about being smart but lazy. Mm-hmm. So like having a new understanding of themselves, and also to lean into whatever their divergence is and how that can be of assistance to themselves, their community, or, overall. And also normalizing self-care, like talking about like, oh, you need sensory breaks. It's okay, you work in a bar or at a classroom, but if you're going to be around people a lot, you're going to blow out your circuit. So don't do anything before, don't do anything after. So not here's a pill and how do you be normal,
right,
but rather understanding the way that you're human and how do you protect yourself in the challenges that are presented by larger society.
Awesome. That's so needed.
Yeah.
Just the skills to survive in the world.
Yeah. Very, very much skills.
To be human.
Yes. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the work you do, Dr. Edmonds Biglow. And
thank you. Thank you for having me. And thank you for your work and like trying to bring this topic to the broader community, because we can't talk about it enough.
Thanks for tuning in to the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. Be sure to follow us on social media at Your Rights Camp and subscribe on YouTube at Know Your Rights Camp.